Some loves don't die. They wait, buried in the blood, patient as stone, for 100 years, until two hearts are brave enough to carry them. The waiting ends now. Our story begins. The dungeon classrooms smelled of cold iron and older sorrow. Hermione Granger had volunteered for this duty the way she volunteered for everything that autumn, because keeping her hands busy was the only spell that worked against the quiet. The war had ended in May. It was October now, and Hogwarts had been rebuilt stone by stone. But some rooms still held the shape of what had happened in them, the way a struck bell holds its note long after the sound has gone. This one, deep beneath the castle, had been chosen as a holding vault for the confiscated objects the Aurors had not yet decided what to do with. Cursed brooches, sealed grimoires, lockets and rings, and small ugly things that hummed with intentions their makers had long since died regretting. She moved along the trestle tables with a clipboard and a self-inking quill, cataloguing, item by item, a discipline she could trust. She did not look up when the door scraped open behind her, because she already knew who it would be. There was only one other student McGonagall had assigned to this penance, and Hermione had been informed of the pairing with the same flat courtesy one might use to announce bad weather. Draco Malfoy stepped into the candlelight and stopped, as though the air at the threshold had thickened against him. He looked thinner than he had at the trials. The arrogance that used to sit on him like expensive tailoring had been taken in, altered, made to fit a smaller man. He wore black, as he always did, and the silver ring on his right hand caught the flame and threw it back. He did not greet her. She did not greet him. The silence between them had its own architecture by now, load-bearing, familiar, a thing they could both lean against without speaking. "You take that side," she said. "I can read a room, Granger." He took the far table. They worked. The quills scratched. Somewhere above them, water moved through old pipes with a long, hollow groan, the sound the castle made when it was settling its weight in the dark. For an hour, nothing happened that history would remember. Then she reached the locket. It lay in a velvet tray that had gone bald at the corners, a small oval of tarnished gold on a broken chain. There was no warning label, no Aura's red tag of caution. Someone had judged it harmless. A trinket, a keepsake, the kind of thing that gets confiscated by accident in the sweep of a darker horde. She lifted it to record the weight, and her bare thumb pressed the seam where the two halves met. It opened, and the room fell away from her. There was no pain. That was the strange and terrible thing. There was no warning at all, only a sudden substitution. The dungeon traded out for somewhere else as cleanly as a turned page. She was standing in a corridor she had never walked, in a body that was hers and not hers, and her heart was breaking with a grief so specific, so old, so finished, that it could not possibly belong to her. And yet it filled her completely, the way water fills a glass and takes its shape. A man stood at the end of the corridor. She could not see his face. She could see only that he was leaving, that he was meant to leave, that every law of the world had arranged itself to carry him away from her, and that she would have set fire to all of it to keep him for one more hour. "Don't," she thought, in a voice that used her mouth, but spoke a stranger's word. "Don't go. I will not survive the ordinary days. Her hand was lifting, reaching, and she felt the warmth of his fingers a breath before they met hers, the way you feel sunlight through a window before you understand the curtain has opened. Granger! The dungeon came back like a slap of cold air. She was on her knees. She did not remember kneeling. The locket had fallen from her hand and lay on the flagstones, snapped shut again, innocent. Her face was wet. She touched her own cheek and stared at her fingers as though they belonged to someone she'd been introduced to once and disliked. Draco was halfway across the room. He had not reached her. He had stopped 3 feet away, one hand braced on the edge of a table, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there in 7 years of knowing the worst of him. It was not contempt. It was not even the careful blankness he'd worn through the trials. It was recognition, raw and unwilling, the look of a man who has just heard a voice in an empty house. On the floor beside him, a small glass vial had rolled to a stop in a spreading bloom of silver liquid. He had dropped it. He, who never dropped anything, who handled cursed objects with the bored precision of a man bored even by danger. "What did you do?" he said. It did not rise at the end. It was not a question so much as an accusation looking for somewhere to land. "Nothing. The locket..." Her voice came out wrong, thinned, as if she'd been shouting in a dream. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone to feel something solid. "It was nothing. A residual charm. I'm fine." "You're crying." "I'm aware of that. Thank you." He flinched, not at the words, but at the wetness on her face, as though the sight of it cost him something he had not agreed to spend. His hand had risen from the table. It hovered for a moment in the empty air between them, 4 fingers and a thumb, and that silver ring. And Hermione watched it the way one watches a wand being raised, every nerve gone bright and waiting. Then he saw what his own hand was doing. He pulled it back so fast it might have touched flame. He turned away, crossed to the far wall, and stood with his shoulders rigid and his back to her. And for a long moment, the only sound in the dungeon was the 2 of them breathing badly. "It touched you too," she said. It was not a question either. His knuckles, where they gripped the stone ledge of the wall, had gone the colour of bone. She could see the small tremor running through his forearm, the effort it took to hold so still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You felt it. The corridor, the leaving." She got to her feet, slowly, one hand on the table. The grief was draining out of her now, but it left a residue, a tide mark, the memory of a love so total it had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the fact that her own heart was now beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize. "I saw a man. I couldn't see his face. I felt..." She stopped. She could not say, "I felt that I would die without him." Not to Draco Malfoy, not to anyone. "I felt something that wasn't mine." He turned his head, not all the way, just enough that she caught his profile, the sharp line of it, the candlelight catching the pale lashes. His jaw was tight. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and almost careful, and that was the most frightening thing of all, because Draco Malfoy was never careful with her. "I saw a woman," he said. The dungeon seemed to lean in. "I couldn't see her face." He swallowed. "She was reaching for me, and I..." His hand closed into a fist at his side, the ring biting white into the skin of his knuckle. I felt that I had already lost her, that it had already happened, 100 years ago, and it had just happened, both at once. He laughed, a short, ugly sound with no humour in it at all. Which is impossible. So clearly we've both been exposed to something, and we should report it and never speak of it again. It's the same memory, Hermione said. It's nothing. It's the same memory, Malfoy, seen from two ends. I was the woman reaching. You were the man leaving. We touched the same... Don't. The word came out harder than he meant it to. She saw him register that, saw the small recoil. He lowered his voice with visible effort. Don't make it into one of your theories. Don't catalogue it. Whatever that was, it was an accident, and the last thing, the absolute last thing in this world that I want, is to be tangled up in something with you. It should have stung. They had been saying things like that to each other for 7 years, and the saying of them had worn smooth grooves she could fall into without thinking. But it didn't sting, and that was what stopped her cold. Because underneath his words, threaded through them like a second voice singing harmony to a melody, she could feel something else entirely. Something that was not his and was not hers. Something that ached toward him across the cold air of the dungeon with a tenderness so old and so patient that it made her want to weep again. She felt it want to reach for him. And worse, she felt him on the far side of the room, fighting the very same pull, his whole body a clenched refusal. 2 of them, standing in a dungeon full of dead people's cursed possessions, each holding very still, because they had both just understood that the most dangerous object in the room was no longer on any of the tables. "We're going to McGonagall," Hermione said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Now, both of us." "Fine. Fine." Neither of them moved. The locket lay between them on the flagstones, a small, dull eye of gold. And as Hermione bent at last to lift it back into its tray, her fingers brushed the metal one final time. And across the room, without a word, without looking, in the exact same instant, Draco Malfoy pressed his hand flat against his own chest, as though to hold something in. Sleep was the first thing the bond took from her. For 3 nights after the dungeon, Hermione lay in her 8th-year dormitory and watched the canopy of her bed go grey, then pale, then gold, with a dawn she had not earned through rest. She did not toss. That would have been a mercy. Instead, she lay perfectly still while her own mind played her scenes she had never lived. A window seat in a house she had never entered. Rain on diamond-paned glass. A man's voice reading aloud in the next room with a low, patient cadence that made something in her chest unspool like ribbon. And every time she surfaced from it, gasping, certain for one cruel half-second that she had lost someone, she would lie in the dark and conduct an inventory of herself the way she had catalogued the cursed objects. This is my hand. This is my breath. This grief is not mine. I have never loved like this. I have never lost like this. It is borrowed. Give it back. But the trouble with borrowed grief, she was learning, was that it did not announce the seam. It poured straight into the places her own losses had already hollowed out. The parents whose memories she had wiped, the friends she had buried that spring. And once it had filled those hollows, it was indistinguishable from the rest. She could no longer find the edge of herself. That, more than the dreams, was what frightened her into the library at 5:30 each morning, where she sat with the restricted section volumes McGonagall had grudgingly authorized and read until the words swam. McGonagall had not been dismissive. That was almost worse. The headmistress had listened to both their accounts in her tower office, her face going through several careful arrangements, and then she had said very quietly, "I will make inquiries," in the voice of a woman who already suspected the answer and did not relish it. The inquiries took 11 days. In the meantime, the symptoms refined themselves with the precision of something learning the instrument it had been given. Distance was the worst of it. Hermione discovered this by accident, the way she discovered most things, empirically and at cost. On the 4th day, she had skipped breakfast to stay in the library, while Malfoy, she knew, was at the far end of the castle in the greenhouses for her boarding's remedial session. By the time the clock struck 9, she could no longer hold her quill. A pressure had begun behind her sternum, low and dragging, as though a hook had been set under her ribs, and a slow, steady tension applied to the line. It built through the morning. By noon, she was pale and clammy, and could not have explained to a single person what was wrong with her, because nothing was, except that some animal part of her had begun to keen for a direction she refused to name. She found out it was him when she rounded a corner near the charms corridor and walked directly into the relief. It arrived a full second before she saw him. The hook simply released, the line went slack. Her lungs remembered their full capacity all at once. She stopped, one hand against the wall. 20 feet away, Draco Malfoy had stopped too. He was the colour of old wax, and his hand was pressed flat to his own chest in that gesture she had seen in the dungeon. And the moment his eyes found her, the colour came back into his face in a rush he clearly hated. For a moment, they simply stood in the corridor and were able to breathe. Then his expression curdled, because being saved by her was so much worse than being hurt. "You did this," he said, low, walking toward her with the stiff control of a man not certain his legs would obey. Students flowed around them, indifferent, late for lessons. "Whatever you touched in that room, you did this to us." "I touched a locket, Malfoy. I didn't author a curse." But she kept her voice down because she could feel it now. Proximity smoothed the dragging ache into something else, something that hummed along her skin like static before a storm, a low-charged awareness of exactly where he was in space, the heat of him, the careful distance he was keeping and failing to keep. "And lower your voice, unless you'd like to explain to the entire 3rd year why we both look like we've been exhumed." His jaw worked. He glanced at the passing students, and she watched him perform the calculation she had been performing for 4 days, that this was a thing too strange and too intimate to be witnessed, that whatever was happening to them had to be hidden, and that hiding it meant, intolerably, being in collusion with her. "Library," he said through his teeth. "After supper, the far alcove." "I beg you've been living there since Tuesday. Don't pretend it's a hardship." He was already turning away, and she felt the cost of it immediately, the line beginning to draw taut again the instant he put distance between them. He felt it too. She watched his shoulders hitch. He did not look back. "And Granger, find out what it is. You're insufferable, but you're thorough. I'd rather owe you than die of you." He walked away. The hook set under her ribs and began patiently to pull. He came to the alcove at 8, and he came with parchment. She had not expected that. She had expected him to arrive empty-handed and contemptuous, prepared to let her do the labor while he supervised her failures, the way he had through 6 years of shared classes. Instead, he dropped into the chair across the small table, set down a roll covered in his own narrow, slanting hand, and said, without preamble, "Malfoy Library. I wrote home. Don't look so astonished. It's unflattering." She unrolled it. His mother had answered. The script in the margins was different, finer. And between the two of them, they had assembled a fragment of family history that the Malfoys had clearly preferred to forget. There had been a son, 2 generations back, who was never spoken of. Calum Malfoy, the elder brother of Abraxas, which made him the rightful heir. And he had been disinherited, struck from the tapestry, the year before he died. The reason had been recorded nowhere the family kept, but his mother had found in the cellars a single thing the burning had missed: a portrait turned to the wall, and behind it, pressed flat against the canvas, a pressed flower and a name in a woman's hand. C.G. Hermione's own research had been running all this time down a parallel rail. She slid her notebook across the table without a word. She had found the woman first. Cassandra Granger, born 1898, a half-blood witch the pure-blood records mentioned only to dismiss. Married beneath her station, line considered terminated. Except it had not been terminated. It had narrowed and gone quiet and survived in Muggle towns under a name nobody in the wizarding world thought to track, until it produced, 80 years later, a girl who turned out to be very good at magic indeed. She loved him, Hermione said. Her finger rested on the date. Calum. They couldn't. The families, the blood, the year it was. And then he died, and a year later so did she, and... She stopped. The borrowed grief stirred in her like a sleeper turning over. The ritual. I found a reference, a soul binding. It's not in any of the standard texts because it's not supposed to be survivable. You bind your soul to another, and if you can't have the person in your life, you... Her voice did something unsteady. She controlled it. You seed it forward. You bind the love into the blood, and you let it wait. For a descendant on each side judged worthy of carrying it, so that what you couldn't have, they could. The candle between them guttered in a draught from nowhere. Draco had gone very still. He was looking at the flower in his mother's letter, the small, flattened ghost of it, and his thumb moved once across the parchment as though he could feel the petals through it. Worthy, he repeated. The word came out scraped. It chose us. Apparently, it chose me. And there it was. The thing she had felt in the dungeon, the harmony beneath the words. He set the letter down with exaggerated care, and his hand, when he withdrew it, was not quite steady. You understand the joke of it. Whatever that woman wanted to pass on, devotion, fidelity, whatever shining bloody thing she thought was worth dying twice for, it crossed 100 years to find the worthiest Malfoy left standing, and it found me. Malfoy, don't. He stood, fast, the chair legs barking against stone. He turned away from her toward the dark stacks, and his shoulders were rigid, and one hand had risen to grip the edge of the nearest shelf, the silver ring biting bone pale against his knuckle. He said nothing further. He did not catalogue his sins for her. He never had. But the silence he poured into that gap was worse than any speech, dense and freighted, the silence of a man holding a door shut against a flood. Hermione rose too. The line between them had been slack all evening, soothed by nearness, and now as he stood there refusing to face her, she became aware of something new threading through it. Not the grief, not the static, something warmer and far more dangerous. It was moving from her toward him across the small dark space of the alcove, a tenderness that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the fact that her heart was beating in a stranger's time, and it wanted to comfort him, wanted it with an ancient and bottomless patience, wanted to cross the room and lay a hand flat between his shoulder blades and tell him that he was, that he had always been, that of course he was worthy. She gripped the back of her chair until the wood hurt her palm. Not mine, she told herself savagely. That is not mine. That is a dead woman who never met him. But her feet had carried her one step forward before she caught them. And on the far side of the alcove, his back still turned, Draco Malfoy went absolutely rigid. And she understood with a lurch that he had felt it cross the distance, that whatever she had just failed to suppress had reached him through the bond as clearly as a spoken word. He turned around. The candlelight caught his face, and what was written there was not contempt, and not even his familiar, elegant cruelty. It was alarm, the specific, cornered alarm of a person who has just been touched somewhere no one is allowed to touch by a hand that isn't there. "Stop," he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Whatever you're, stop doing that." "I'm not doing anything." But her own voice shook, because it was a lie, and they both knew it. She was doing it by failing to not do it, by being unable to tell where the dead woman ended and she began. "I can't. It's not me. It's not on purpose. I can't always tell which feelings are." "Then learn," he said. And for one moment the desperation in it stripped away every defense he owned, and she saw straight through to the boy underneath, who was as frightened as she was. "Learn fast, because I have spent my whole life being made to feel things other people decided I should feel, and I will not let two corpses turn me into—" He stopped. The line had gone taut, and then impossibly warm, and they both felt it at once. The bond drawing them a half-step closer with no instruction from either of them, the air between the stacks gone dense as the moment before lightning, and Hermione realized her hand had lifted from the chair and was reaching across the dark toward him, and that his own hand, traitorously, had begun to rise to meet it. They broke apart as if the floor had tilted. Hermione got her hand back to her side through an act of will that left her trembling, and Draco stepped backward into the dark of the stacks until a shelf stopped him, and for a long moment they stood at the two far edges of the alcove and stared at each other across a space that the bond was already trying, patiently, to close. "This," he said, when he could speak, "is unacceptable." "On that," she said, "we are agreed." So they made rules. It was the only thing either of them knew how to do with terror, to organize it, to draw boundaries around the unbearable and label them. They sat back down, careful to keep the full width of the table between them, and Hermione tore a clean sheet from her notebook, and they negotiated the terms of their imprisonment like two diplomats from countries that had only just stopped shooting at each other. Proximity, they established, was required. The dragging ache that came with distance was not survivable past a certain radius. They tested it grimly over the following days, walking apart in the empty corridors after curfew and noting the exact point at which breathing became labor. 40 feet, give or take. Beyond that, the hook set under the ribs. Beyond 100, one of them would buckle. So they would arrange their schedules to overlap. They would sit at opposite ends of the same library, the same great hall, the same insufferable proximity, like two stars locked in orbit around a thing neither could see. Touch was forbidden. That clause went on the parchment underlined twice in her hand at his insistence. They had both felt what the smallest contact threatened to unlatch. They would not test its limit. And feeling, the third rule, the impossible one, feeling would be policed. Each of them would be responsible for their own side of the line. When the borrowed tenderness rose, they would name it, push it back, refuse it passage across the bond. Discipline, Draco called it, with the bitterness of a man who had been raised on the word as a weapon. Hermione called it containment, and privately did not believe in it for a moment. She was right not to, because the bond, it turned out, did not respect their parchment. It had been waiting 100 years, and it had the patience of the dead. The dreams came whether they slept apart or not, and they came shared. She knew it was shared because of what happened the third morning. She had dreamed of the window seat again, the rain, the diamond panes, the man's low voice reading in the next room. And this time the dream had let her rise and cross the floor and stand in the doorway and look, and for the first time she had seen his hands. Long, pale hands, a signet ring, the page turning. She had woken with her heart going like a struck thing, and she had gone down to the alcove before dawn, and Draco had been there already. He never came before dawn. He had come this once. He did not look up from the table. He said, in a flat voice that was working very hard at flatness, she was wearing blue. The floor went out from under her. What? In the, wherever it was, the house with the rain. His thumb was moving on the table edge, back and forth, a small, helpless metronome. She came to the doorway, and she was wearing blue, and her hair was coming down on one side, and she watched me read for a long time before I knew she was there. He looked up then, and his eyes were terrible. I have never read aloud to anyone in my life. I don't own that house. I've never owned that ring. And I can tell you the exact weight of that book in my hands. Hermione sat down slowly across from him. I was the woman in the doorway, she said. I saw your hands. Neither of them spoke for a while. The library breathed around them, that vast cathedral hush, the dust turning gold where the first light came slanting through the high east windows. Somewhere a portrait snored. The bond hummed between them, low and content, the way a cat purrs over something it has caught. They're using us, Draco said at last, and there was no heat in it now, only a tired horror. To finish, they never got there, whatever they wanted, the ordinary days, the house with the rain, and so there. He gestured between the two of them, a small, disgusted motion. Replaying it, through us. We're not people to it, Granger. We're a stage. She wanted to argue. She was constitutionally incapable of not arguing with him. But she had felt the truth of it in the doorway of that dream. The sense of being walked through a role already written, of her own longing pressed into a shape that fit a stranger's exactly. And she could not make her mouth form the contradiction. "Then we starve it," she said instead. He raised an eyebrow. "It runs on the feeling. On us, letting it through, replaying it, giving it the performance it wants." She was building the theory as she spoke, the way she always did, fitting the pieces while the glue was still wet. "So, we don't perform. We stay near enough to survive, and we feel nothing toward each other, and eventually it has nothing to feed on, and it weakens enough to break." "You're proposing," he said slowly, "that the cure for being haunted by two people who died of love is to feel nothing whatsoever." "Yes." "For each other." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not read, and when he spoke, his voice had gone very dry. "Granger, I have despised you for 7 years. I assure you, it is the one feeling I am fully equipped to deliver on demand." It should have stung. It was designed to. And the strange thing, the thing that made her drop her gaze to the table and arrange her quills with sudden, unnecessary care, was that it did not sting at all, and worse, that she could feel it not stinging him either, could feel through the bond the precise hollowness of the words, a habit to perform over a thing that had quietly stopped being true, and that neither of them had told. "Good," she said to her quills. "Then it should be easy." It was not easy. It worked, for 9 days, the way a dam works, by holding back exactly as much as it holds back, and no more. They sat at opposite ends of rooms. They did not speak unless required. When the borrowed warmth rose in her, and it rose constantly now, at the smallest provocation, the curve of his hand around a teacup, the particular way he frowned at a difficult line of text, she ground it down to nothing and felt him do the same on his side, and the bond, denied its theatre, grew thin and irritable, and began, she was almost sure, to weaken. And then, on the 10th day, Theodore Knott broke Draco's nose in the courtyard, and the whole architecture of their containment came down in an afternoon. It was not even about her. Knott had his own war to settle. A brother in Azkaban, a grudge with the Malfoy name, the kind of old poison the castle was full of that autumn. Hermione was 3 corridors away in the library when it happened, and she knew the instant it happened because the bond carried it to her undiluted. A white burst of pain across her own face, the copper taste of blood that was not in her mouth, and underneath it, far worse, a flare of something she had spent 9 days starving. Pure, undefended fear for him, hers, and the dead woman's together, indistinguishable, total. She was on her feet before she decided to stand. She was running before she remembered the rule about running in the library. The hook under her ribs had become a rope, and the rope was hauling her bodily through the castle, and she did not fight it, because for once it was pulling her exactly where every part of her, borrowed and her own, she no longer cared which, wanted to go. She came out into the courtyard in the cold grey light, and there he was on the flagstones, blood sheeting from his nose, not already being dragged off by 2 7th years. a small crowd gathering with the awful relish of people watching someone they don't like get hurt. And Draco was getting up. Of course he was getting up. He would have died before he let them see him stay down. And his eyes were unfocused with pain, and they found her across the courtyard with the unerring accuracy of a compass finding north. She crossed the distance. She did not think about the rule. She knelt on the cold stone in front of him, and her hands came up to his face before either of them could remember they were forbidden. And the moment her fingers touched the sharp, blood-slicked line of his jaw, the bond detonated between them. Not pain now, but the opposite. A flood of recognition so vast and so old it had no bottom. Every dream and every borrowed grief and every starved-down tenderness arriving all at once, and beneath all of it, terribly, unmistakably, in a voice that used her hands but spoke for two of them, the simple, unsurvivable fact. There you are, I thought I had lost you again. Draco went rigid under her hands. His breath stopped. The blood ran warm over her fingers, and neither of them moved. And in the gathering crowd, someone said something she didn't hear, and the grey light came down on the two of them kneeling in the courtyard, and his bloodied hand rose, shaking, and closed around her wrist, not to push her away. His hand closed around her wrist and held it there, against his own face, in front of everyone, for exactly as long as it took the bond to finish saying what it had to say. Then sense returned to him like cold water, and he let go. "Get up," he said, low and rough, the blood thickening his voice. "Granger, get up. People are watching." They were. She could feel the crowd's attention crawling over the back of her neck. Hermione Granger on her knees in the courtyard, with her hands cupped around Draco Malfoy's bleeding face. An image that would be around the castle by supper, distorted and embroidered, and impossible to take back. She rose. Her fingers were red to the second knuckle. She did not know what to do with them, so she pressed them flat against her own thigh and felt the warmth of his blood soak slowly into her skirt. "Madame Pomfrey," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Now. You can walk or I can levitate you, and I promise you the second option will be more humiliating." He walked. She walked beside him, close, too close, the rule already in ruins, but the bond had been fed now, and it had gone quiet and sated and almost gentle, and the silence it left in its wake was the most dangerous thing of all. Because in that silence, she could no longer pretend. She had felt what crossed between them in the courtyard. She had felt the part of it that belonged to a dead woman. Yes. The I thought I had lost you, the century of waiting folded into one instant. But she had also felt, threaded through it, fine as a single bright wire, something that had no ancestor at all. Something that had looked at Draco Malfoy bleeding on the stones and been afraid in a way that was entirely, inconveniently her own. She did not tell him that. He did not ask. Pomfrey set the nose with a snap and a muttered charm and a long, suspicious look at the two of them that asked questions she was too discreet to voice aloud. She left them in the curtained alcove with a paste for the bruising and instructions Hermione didn't listen to. And then they were alone in the white quiet of the hospital wing, with the afternoon going dim at the high windows. Draco sat on the edge of the cot. The bruising was already blooming purple under his eyes, and it made him look younger and stranger. The elegance knocked sideways. He turned the small jar of paste over in his hands and did not open it. "You broke the rule," he said. "I know. You came running across half the castle and knelt down in front of 40 people and put your hands on me." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the jar. "Why?" "Because you were hurt." She heard the inadequacy of it even as she said it. "Because I felt it happen. Because the bond—" "Don't." He set the jar down on the cot beside him with a small click. "Don't give it to the bond. Not this time. I felt what came across when you touched me, Granger. I've gotten adept these last weeks at telling the difference. The grief, the dreams, the wanting that arrives wearing a 100-year-old coat. That's hers. I know the texture of it now." He finally looked up, and the bruised eyes were very direct. But there was something underneath it that didn't have her shape. That was just fast and frightened and entirely too modern to be a ghost, wasn't it? She should have lied. 7 years of practice had given her an excellent inventory of cruelties she could have reached for, any one of which would have closed this door and locked it. Don't flatter yourself. It was reflex. It was the magic. The words were right there. She picked up the jar instead, unscrewed the lid, and dipped 2 fingers into the cool paste. "Hold still," she said. He went rigid. "What are you?" "You can't see your own face, and you'll do it wrong, and it'll scar, and then your mother will write me a letter, and I would genuinely rather be hexed." She stepped between his knees before she could think better of it, tilted his chin up with one hand, the rule in ash now, and began, very lightly, to work the paste into the bruise spreading beneath his eye. He held still. That was the thing that undid her in the end. Not the courtyard, not the bond, not the dead woman's longing pouring through her like light through a window. It was Draco Malfoy holding perfectly still under her hands in the dim hospital wing, letting her tend him, his breath gone shallow and careful, his eyes fixed on her face with an attention so total it had weight. He had spent his whole life, she understood suddenly, being touched only by people who wanted something from him. And he was holding still now, the way an animal holds still, braced for the trick inside the kindness. There was no trick. That was what she had to sit with, her fingers moving in slow circles over the heat of his skin, the bite of his cheekbone, the soft place beneath his eye. There was no trick, and she could not find the dead woman anywhere in what she was feeling. She looked for her. She looked hard, and there was only Hermione standing between his knees, learning the architecture of his face with 2 fingers, her own heart loud in her ears. "Granger," he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. You're not telling her to stop." His eyes hadn't left her face. Whatever's coming across right now, you're not pushing it back. You haven't pushed it back since you knelt down in that courtyard." Her fingers stilled against his cheek. "I can't find her," Hermione said. It came out barely above a breath. That's the thing I can't say to you, that I haven't been able to say. I've gotten good at it too. The texture, like you said, I know hers. And right now, I can't find her anywhere, and I'm still standing here, and I still don't want to take my hand away. She made herself meet his eyes. So, either she's gotten cleverer at hiding, or this part was never hers. The space between them had gone dense as the air before a storm breaks. She was close enough to feel the warmth coming off him, close enough to see the unsteadiness in his breathing, close enough that lowering her hand and stepping back would have taken a deliberate act of retreat that neither of them was performing. His hand came up, slowly, with the care of a man diffusing something. It did not touch her. It stopped a hair's breadth from her jaw, the way her hand had hovered over him in the dungeon weeks ago, the heat of his palm, a near thing against her skin. The silver ring caught the last grey light from the window. "This is a catastrophe," he said quietly. "You understand that. If this is real, if there's a single thread of this that's actually ours and not theirs, then we can't blame the magic anymore. And I don't know what's worse." His thumb hovered, not landing, just barely tracing the air at the line of her cheek. "Being made to want you by two dead strangers, or finding out I'd have done it on my own. Malfoy. I broke things," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle of it. He didn't catalogue. He didn't list his sins or perform his guilt for her absolution. He just said it, 2 words, and let them sit there in the white quiet, his eyes going to some middle distance full of things she would never fully see. And that small, unfinished honesty, that refusal to dress it up, reached into her chest and closed a fist. "I broke things that don't mend. And you stood up in the Wizengamot and spoke for my mother, and you have never once needed to be kind to me, and you're standing here with your hands on my face like I'm something worth not letting scar." His jaw worked. "I don't have anywhere to put that. I genuinely don't." The paste had gone tacky on her fingers. The light was nearly gone. Somewhere beyond the curtain, Madame Pomfrey's footsteps crossed the ward and faded. Hermione looked at the hand hovering at her cheek, the long, pale fingers, the bone-white knuckle where it had gripped 100 shelves and ledgers and wand handles to keep from reaching. The silver ring she now realized she had seen in a dream, on a man reading by a rain-streaked window 100 years before either of them was born. And she understood that they had come to the edge of something the parchment could not govern. "Then don't put it anywhere," she said. "Just—" She turned her face very slightly into his waiting hand. His palm met her cheek, warm, unsteady, real. And the bond did not detonate this time. It did not flood them with a dead woman's century of longing. It simply sighed and settled and went quiet, as though the 2 ghosts who had waited 100 years had finally seen what they came to see and stepped back to let the living have the room. And in that silence, with no magic left to blame and nothing borrowed in it at all, Draco Malfoy drew her face down toward his, slowly, giving her every chance to stop, his breath unsteady against her lips, the last grey light failing at the window, and stopped, a hair's breadth away, because the curtain rings shrieked across their rod, and Pomfrey's voice said, "Mr. Malfoy, I distinctly said—" They sprang apart so fast that Hermione knocked the jar of paste off the cot, and it rolled in a wide accusing arc across the floor to stop precisely at Madame Pomfrey's feet. The matron looked down at it. She looked at the 2 of them. Draco frozen on the edge of the cot with bruise paste on his cheek, and his hand still half raised. Hermione standing between his knees, with 2 tacky fingers and a colour rising in her face that no charm would hide. Pomfrey's mouth pressed into a thin line that contained, with visible difficulty, a great many words. "Visiting hours," she said at last, "are over." Hermione fled. She told herself it was dignity. It was not dignity. It was self-preservation, because if she had stayed in that white quiet one moment longer, she would have finished what the curtain had interrupted, and she was not ready, could not possibly be ready, to have done that on purpose, knowing it was hers, with no ghost to hide behind. She went straight to the library and sat in the alcove with her hands flat on the cold table until they stopped shaking, and she did the only thing she knew how to do with a feeling too large to hold. She turned it back into a problem to be solved. "If it's real," she wrote in a hand less steady than usual, "then severance is possible without loss. If it's borrowed, severance ends it. Either way, find the severance." She underlined "find the severance" twice, the way she and Draco had underlined the rule about touch, and she did not let herself notice the irony, because that was the trap they had walked into, the 2 of them, and she could see its whole shape now. As long as they could blame the magic, they were safe. Every glance, every nearness, every traitorous warmth. It's the bond, it's the dead, it isn't me. And behind that wall, a person could feel anything at all and never have to own it. The wall was the kindest thing the curse had given them. And she had just stood in a hospital wing and torn a hole in it with her own 2 fingers. And now she could see straight through to the unbearable possibility on the other side. That if you took the magic away entirely, something would remain. Something with her name on it. Something with his. So she would take the magic away, cleanly, surgically, and then they would both know. It was, she would think later, the most cowardly brave thing she had ever planned. He found her there at midnight. She knew his step now, knew it the way the bond knew it, a quickening under her ribs 3 corridors before the sound reached her ears. And she did not look up when he sat down across from her. "You ran," he said. "I observed that the hospital wing was closed." "You ran, Granger." He said it without heat. There was a fresh bruise of exhaustion under the fading one Knot had given him. "It's all right. I'd have run too if my legs had been working. Pomfrey will have it round the staff room by breakfast that we were." He stopped. He did not finish it. The unfinished thing sat between them on the table, more present than anything either of them could have said. She turned her notebook around and pushed it across to him. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the line of his jaw, the small downward movement at the corner of his mouth, the way his thumb pressed against the words, "Find the severance," as though to feel whether they were warm or cold. "You want to break it," he said. "I want to know," she said. "That's not the same thing. Right now, we can't tell anything. Every time one of us feels something, we hand it to the ghosts and walk away clean. We could go on doing that for the rest of our lives and never once find out what's actually." Her voice did something she didn't authorize. She steadied it. "If we break the bond and there's nothing left, then we were right, and it was them, and we go back to despising each other, and it's a story we never tell anyone. And if we break it and something's still there, then we're out of excuses," he finished quietly. "Yes." He set the notebook down. For a long moment, He was very still, and she felt him deciding, felt it across the bond, the way you feel weather changing. And what she felt was not relief and not eagerness, but something more complicated, a kind of grief that ran ahead of the event, mourning a thing that hadn't happened yet. "You understand what you're asking," he said. "If it's real, breaking the bond won't kill it, but it'll take them away. The dreams, the house with the rain, her at the doorway in blue." He wasn't looking at her now. Granger, I have never in my life felt anything as clean as what she felt for him. Whatever else is wrong with it, whatever it's done to us, when it comes through, it's the only thing I've ever felt that didn't have a hook in it somewhere. And you want to cut it out. She had not expected that. She had expected him to seize on severance like a drowning man. The chance to be free of the dead, free of the bond, free of her. Instead, he was grieving it in advance. This borrowed love, the only uncomplicated tenderness a boy raised in that cold house had ever been allowed to feel, even at second hand, even through 100 years. "I know," she said softly. "I'll miss her too." His eyes came up. "I will," she said. "She gave me. I didn't have anything like that either, Malfoy. Not really. I've been at war since I was 11. And then this woman who's been dead for a century started loving someone through me, all the way down, with everything. And it was..." She pressed her lips together. "It was the most loved I've ever felt. And it wasn't even for me. So, yes, I want to cut it out, because I would rather have a small true thing that's mine than a vast borrowed thing that isn't, even if the true thing turns out to be nothing at all." The candle had burned low between them. The library was a vast dark hush, the stacks receding into black, the high windows holding a few cold stars. The bond lay quiet in the space between them, listening, she thought, to its own death being planned. "Where did you find it?" Draco said at last. "The severance." It was in none of the standard texts, of course. It was in the same restricted volume that had given up the ritual itself. A thin, water-stained book of old binding magic, the kind the library kept chained, and the kind McGonagall had authorized them to read, only because she could not think of a reason to refuse 2 students dying slowly of a curse. The severance was the ritual run backward. That was the elegance and the horror of it. To bind 2 souls, the original lovers had stood together at the turning of a night, hand in hand, and spoken a vow that fused what they were into the blood to wait for the worthy. To unbind it, the inheritors had to do the same thing in reverse, stand together at the turning of a night, hand in hand, and speak a renunciation. We do not accept what was given. We return it to the dead. We will not carry it forward. Hand in hand, Draco repeated, reading over her shoulder. He had come around the table to see. He was standing close behind her now, closer than the rule had ever allowed, and she could feel the warmth of him along her whole back and would not turn around. We have to touch, for the whole of it, and speak the renunciation, both of us, meaning it. His voice had gone very quiet just above her ear. It won't work if we don't mean it. That's the whole architecture of binding magic. Intention is the spell. We have to stand there holding hands at midnight and want to give each other back. She turned the page. There was nothing more, just the words of the renunciation in a cramped old hand and a line beneath it that someone some long-dead librarian, or the book's author, or perhaps Cassandra herself, had added in fainter ink, almost a warning, almost a dare. What is returned to the dead departs. What was never theirs remains. She read it twice. She felt him reading it over her shoulder, his breath stirring the hair at her temple, his hand braced flat on the table beside hers, the silver ring an inch from her own fingers. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. Neither of them moved. The candle guttered. His hand was an inch from hers on the dark wood, and the bond hummed low and grieving between them, and Hermione understood that they were about to spend their last day as two people who could still blame the magic for everything, and that tomorrow, hand in hand at the turning of the night, they would speak the words that took every excuse away and find out, finally and forever, what was left of them when nothing borrowed remained. His little finger moved, just that. It crossed the inch of dark wood and came to rest against the side of her hand, the lightest possible weight, not the ritual, not anything either of them could be held to. And she did not pull away, and he did not press further, and they stood like that in the dying candlelight, barely touching on the last night before they meant to let each other go. They chose the astronomy tower because it was the highest turning of the night the castle had to offer, and because no one went there anymore. The war had emptied it of romance. It was where Dumbledore had died, and the students gave it a wide berth out of a respect none of them quite knew how to name, and so it was, that midnight, entirely theirs. It had begun to rain. Hermione had not planned for the rain, but it came anyway, soft at first and then steady, drumming on the parapet and silvering the long fall of dark beyond the rail. The wind came with it, cold off the lake, and it carried the smell of wet stone and far-off lightning, that sharp green scent of a storm still deciding whether to break. She climbed the last turn of the stair with the water-stained book under her arm, and her heart going hard. And she found Draco already there, standing at the rail with his back to her, the rain darkening his pale hair to the colour of old pewter, looking out at nothing. He turned when she reached the top. The single torch in its bracket guttered and steadied. In its light, his face was very pale and very still. The bruise from Knot faded now to a faint yellow shadow, and his eyes found hers across the wet stone with an expression she had no name for. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say a great many things." He said it without bitterness, almost gently, as though stating a law of nature he had learned the hard way. The rain ran down the side of his face, and he did not wipe it away. "I half thought you'd send a note. On reflection, the experiment is unsound, something thorough and final. Would you have been relieved?" He looked at her for a long moment. The rain came down between them. "No," he said. "I'd have come up here anyway and stood in the rain like a fool, and I'd have told myself it was the cold making my eyes sting." She had not known he could say a thing like that. She filed it away with the small, terrible inventory she had been keeping all these weeks, the things Draco Malfoy turned out to be when no one was watching and there was nothing left to defend. She set the book on the parapet and opened it to the marked page. The rain immediately began to spot the old paper, the ink swimming at the edges, and she shielded it with her hand. The renunciation was short. That was the cruelty of it. 3 sentences. A handful of seconds and 100 years of waiting would be undone, and they would know. "We hold hands for the whole of it," she said. Her voice was not as steady as she wanted. "And we mean it. We want to give each other back. I remember the architecture, Granger. I'm reminding myself, not you." Something crossed his face at that, a flicker, quickly hidden. He stepped closer until the width of the open book was the only distance between them, until she could see the rain caught in his lashes and the unsteadiness in his breathing that the cold did not explain. "Then we should do it," he said, "before either of us thinks too hard." He held out his hand. She looked at it. The long, pale fingers, the silver ring she had seen in another man's dream 100 years ago, the bone-white knuckle that had gripped 100 edges to keep from reaching for her. The rain ran over his open palm. He was offering it to her so they could let each other go, and the bond, sensing the shape of what was coming, had begun to keen low under her ribs. A sound with no voice, the dead protesting their own second death. She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the rain, and the bond flared bright and grieving between them. And for a moment they simply stood there, hand in hand at the turning of the night, with the storm coming down around them and a century of longing humming up their joined arms. She felt Cassandra in it. She felt her, clear and close, the way you feel someone standing just behind you in the dark. The woman in blue, the house with the rain, the man she could not have and bound her soul to anyway, rather than let the love die with her. "Don't," the ghost said, with all the patience of the grave. "Don't send us away." We waited so long. We were almost home. Hermione's throat closed. "Now," Draco said, very low. And they spoke it together, the renunciation, the words pulling from somewhere deep and reluctant, the rain swallowing the edges of them. "We do not accept what was given." The bond shuddered. The torch guttered low. "We return it to the dead." The keening rose to something almost audible, a high, thin note in the storm, and Hermione's hand tightened in Draco's without her telling it to, and she felt him grip back just as hard, the two of them holding on for dear life to each other in the very act of letting go. "We will not carry it forward." The night broke open. There was no flash, no thunder, nothing the eye could have caught. It happened inside, a vast, soundless tearing, as though a tapestry that had hung in her chest for weeks were being lifted off its hooks all at once, and the place where it had hung went suddenly, shockingly bare. The dreams went. She felt them go. The window seat, the diamond panes, the low voice reading, the woman in blue at the doorway, all of it folding away into the dark like a hand withdrawn from water. Gone, gone, gone. The borrowed grief went with it, the century of waiting, the vast, patient love that had filled her so completely she had mistaken it for her own self. And Cassandra, Hermione felt her leave, felt the ghost that had lived behind her own ribs for a month turn at last and go, and felt she would swear to it forever. A last brush of something like gratitude, like blessing, like a woman at last permitted to rest before the presence thinned to nothing and the tower held only rain. The bond was gone. Hermione stood in the silence it left and waited to feel free. She did not feel free. She stood on the wet stone with her hand in Draco Malfoy's hand, and the rain coming down and the whole vast borrowed architecture of the curse swept clean out of her in a single breath, and her heart was still pounding. Her face was still turned up to his. Her fingers were still wound through his fingers, and she had not let go, and he had not let go, and there was no bond left to blame for any of it. She made herself look at him. He was looking at her already. The rain ran down his face, and his eyes were wide and stunned and afraid, and she understood that the same emptiness had opened in him, that he too had felt the ghosts depart, that he too stood swept clean of everything that wasn't his, and that he, like her, was still here, still holding on, still turned toward the one person he was now entirely free to turn away from. "It's gone," he said. His voice came out cracked. "Granger, I can't feel them. I can't feel any of it. The dreams, it's all..." He stopped. His hand tightened on hers, hard, as though to check that she was still real, that this at least had survived. "It's gone." "I know," she whispered. "Then why..." He couldn't finish it. The rain came down. "Why are you still..." "Because it was never theirs," she said. "What is returned to the dead departs. What was never theirs remains." She had read it as a warning. She understood now it had been a promise. Everything borrowed had been swept away. Every dream and every grief and every century-old longing returned to the two who had earned it. And in the bare, swept place where all of it had been, one thing was left standing. One small, true, terrifying thing, with no ghost behind it, and no magic underneath it, and nothing left to blame. It was hers. It had her name on it. And when she looked up into Draco Malfoy's stunned and rain-wet face, she could see with absolute clarity that the matching thing was standing in him too. "It's still here," she said. Her voice shook. She didn't care. "Isn't it? With them gone, it's still..." He let go of her hand. For one plummeting instant, she thought it was over, that he was stepping back, taking the freedom they'd just bought, ending it the clean, cowardly way. The cold rushed into the place his hand had been. And then, both of his hands came up and framed her face, the rain warm where his palms were warm, his thumbs at the line of her cheekbones, and he looked at her with everything stripped away. No bond, no ghost, no 7 years of armor, just Draco, just the boy underneath, who was as frightened as she was, and was choosing it anyway. And he started to draw her in, slowly, the way he had in the hospital wing, giving her every last chance to stop, the rain coming down around them, and the torch hissing, and the whole dark castle holding its breath beneath them. This time there was no curtain to shriek across its rod. There was no one to interrupt. There was only the rain and the height, and his breath unsteady against her lips, and the half-inch of cold, wet air between them that one of them would have to be brave enough to close. She closed it. She had spent her whole life waiting for other people to be brave first, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be permitted, waiting for the world to arrange itself into safety before she risked anything that mattered. She did not wait now. She rose up onto her toes on the wet stone and closed the last cold half-inch herself and kissed him. For a moment, he went utterly still, as though he could not believe it had happened in the direction it had. And then his hands tightened at her jaw, and he kissed her back, and the world narrowed to the warmth of his mouth, and the cold of the rain, and the small broken sound he made against her lips. A sound with no arrogance in it at all, no calculation, nothing but a boy who had not believed he would ever be allowed this, finding out that he was. It was not gentle in the end. It started gentle, and then it was not, because there were 7 years behind it, and a month of forbidden nearness, and a ghost's century of waiting that had taught their bodies the shape of each other before either of them had agreed to learn it. His hand slid back into her wet hair. Her fingers fisted in the front of his soaked robes and held on. The rain came down, and neither of them noticed it anymore, and the torch hissed and guttered in its bracket, and the dark castle fell away beneath them until there was nothing in the whole world but this. This, that was theirs, that had no ghost behind it, that they had bought at the price of giving everything borrowed away. When they broke apart, they did not go far. He rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard, the rain running between their faces, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. That, Draco said finally unsteadily, was a catastrophic experimental result. A laugh broke out of her, half a sob. Was it? You set out to prove there was nothing left. His thumb moved at her cheek, wiping rain or something else away. I'd call that a comprehensive failure of the hypothesis, Granger. Truly, your worst work. Shut up, she said, and kissed him again, and felt him smile against her mouth. And that, the feeling of Draco Malfoy smiling while she kissed him on a rain-soaked tower at midnight with the ghosts finally at rest, was a thing she would keep for the rest of her life. But the morning was a different country. She woke in her own bed with the rain stopped and the grey light coming flat through the window, and the first thing she felt was the absence, the bond gone, the dreams gone, the constant low hum of another presence under her ribs simply not there. And the second thing she felt was terror, because in the clean, cold light of an ordinary Tuesday, the whole architecture of doubt rebuilt itself in an instant. The bond was gone, yes. The ghosts had departed, yes. But how long had they been inside her? A month. A month of a dead woman loving Draco Malfoy through her body, teaching her his face, his voice, the weight of wanting him. A month of having that feeling poured into her again and again until the channel was worn smooth. Just because the source had been cut off did not mean the channel had closed. Maybe what was left wasn't true at all. Maybe it was only habit, a groove worn so deep by a ghost that the water still ran down it out of sheer momentum long after the spring had dried. She had kissed him believing it was hers. What if she had only inherited the shape of wanting and mistaken the empty mold for the thing itself? She did not go down to breakfast. She could not face him across the great hall with this new doubt loud in her chest, could not bear for him to read it on her face. Because he would. He had gotten so good at reading her, and it would land on him like a verdict. So she stayed in the library all morning with a book she did not read, and she felt, for the first time in a month, entirely alone, and discovered that she hated it. That, in the end, was the data she had not expected. She sat in the alcove where they had made their rules and broken every one of them, and she made herself examine the loneliness like a specimen. It was not the dragging ache of the bond. That was gone, truly gone. Her body no longer keened for his direction across the castle. This was different. This was quieter and worse. This was simply missing him. His dry voice, the way he frowned at difficult text, the careful stillness of him when she touched his face, the small broken sound against her mouth in the rain. None of those were things a ghost had given her. The ghost had given her grandeur, longing on a heroic scale, a love built to survive a century. What Hermione missed, sitting alone in the grey morning, was nothing grand at all. It was specific and small and entirely modern, and it had Draco's exact shape, and no dead woman had ever known the things about him that Hermione was missing. You cannot miss what was never yours. That was the proof. The ghost's love had departed clean. She'd felt it go, felt the bareness it left. This had stayed because it had grown its own roots, quietly, all the while she'd been busy blaming the magic. She put her head down on the cold table and let herself understand it. And then she went to find him. He was not hard to find. He was on the tower. She knew it before she climbed, the way she would once have known it through the bond, except that this time it was not magic telling her. It was simply that she knew him now, knew where a person like him would go to stand alone with a fear he couldn't name. She climbed the last turn of the stair and found him at the rail in the grey morning light, exactly where he'd stood the night before. And when he heard her step, he went rigid and did not turn around. "You didn't come to breakfast," he said to the lake. "No. I thought—" His knuckles were white on the wet rail. He did not finish it. He did not perform the fear for her, did not list the ways he'd convinced himself she'd come to her senses and regretted everything in the cold light of day. He just stood there with his back to her and his hands gripping the stone, and the silence said all of it, dense and freighted, the silence of a man braced for the trick inside the kindness. "I thought it might not be real," she said to his back. "This morning, I woke up and the bond was gone, and I thought she was in me for a month, Malfoy. What if she wore a path so deep that I'm still walking it out of habit? What if I kissed you because a ghost taught my body to want to?" His shoulders came up. He still didn't turn. "And," the word was very careful, "and I spent all morning alone in the library," she said. "And I missed you. Not grandly. Not the way she missed him, that great roaring century-long thing. I missed your voice. I missed the way you frown at footnotes. I missed the sound you made last night. And she never heard that sound, Malfoy. She's been dead 100 years. That sound is mine." Her voice cracked. "You can't inherit the missing of something specific. She gave me the longing, but she never gave me you. I had to learn you myself, and I did, and I can't stop." He turned around. His face, in the grey light, was undone. The careful control had gone out of it entirely, and what was left was raw and disbelieving, and so openly hopeful that it hurt to look at. This boy who had spent his whole life certain that anything good was a trick or a transaction, standing on a rain-dark tower, hearing that he was wanted for himself by the one person who had every reason in the world not to. "I broke things," he said again. The same 2 words from the hospital wing, the only confession he seemed able to make, except that this time he kept going, his voice low and unsteady, his eyes fixed on hers. "I'll be paying for the rest of my life. I don't get to be. Happy isn't a thing I'd budgeted for, Granger. I made my peace with that. And then a ghost dropped you into the middle of my life, And I told myself the whole time it was the magic. Because if it was the magic, then it wasn't real. And if it wasn't real, then I couldn't lose it. He swallowed. And now the magic's gone, and you're standing there, and I have nothing left to hide behind, and you're telling me it's still here, she said. He crossed the tower in 3 steps and kissed her, and this time it was not desperate, and it was not stolen, and there was no rain to blame, and no ghost to credit. It was just the 2 of them, in the grey, ordinary morning, choosing it with their eyes open. And when he drew back, he kept his forehead against hers, and she felt the tremor still running through him, the disbelief that this was allowed to be his. "Say it without the ghost," he whispered. "Just once. So, I know it's you." "It's me," she said. "It was always going to be me. I just needed a dead woman to make me brave enough to find out." His arms came around her, and she felt him let go of something he had been holding his whole life. And over his shoulder, the grey clouds were beginning, just beginning, to thin toward a light that had not yet decided whether to be the sun. There was one thing left to do, and it was Hermione who realized it. 3 days later, lying with her head on Draco's chest in the late afternoon light of an empty classroom they had quietly made their own. "They never finished," she said. He had been half asleep, one hand moving idly through her hair, and he stirred at the sound of her voice. "Cassandra and Calum." She propped herself up to look at him. The light came slanting gold through the high windows, the dust turning in it, and it caught the silver ring on his hand. The ring she now knew had been his ring, the heir's ring, struck from the family with the brother who had worn it, and somehow surviving anyway, passed down to a great-grandson who didn't know its history until a ghost taught it to him. They poured everything into the binding, their whole love, the whole of it, into the blood to wait for us, and we sent it back to them on the tower. But Malfoy, we sent it back unfinished. We renounced it. We said we will not carry it forward. We let them rest, but we let them rest with the thing they died wanting still undone. He was fully awake now, watching her. "You think they're not at peace?" "I think they got to see." She turned the thought over, fitting the pieces. "That last brush when she left, I felt it as gratitude, as though she'd waited 100 years for one thing, and got it, and could finally go." But what did she get to see exactly? 2 people standing on a tower swearing they didn't want what she'd given them. That's not the ending she waited a century for, Draco. We gave each other back to the living by giving her love back to the dead. We chose each other by refusing her. She sat up properly. I don't want that to be how it ends for them. I don't want our whole story to begin with us renouncing theirs. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him understand it, watched the thing move behind his eyes. He had grown up in a house that taught him love was a transaction and lineage was a cage, and she could see him turning now toward a different idea entirely, that a bond passed down through blood did not have to be a debt or a sentence, that it could be, if you chose it freely, a gift. "Then we finish it," he said slowly. "For them, on our own terms." They went back to the tower at the next turning of the night, and this time there was no rain. The sky had cleared entirely. It was one of those rare cold nights when the stars came down close and hard and bright, the whole spilled wealth of them flung across the black, and the lake below held the moon like a coin in dark water. The air had that scorched, clean smell of frost arriving. The torch in its bracket burned steady for once, with nothing to gutter it. They had not found instructions for this. There were none. The book had given them the binding and the severance, the making and the unmaking, but there was no recorded ritual for what they meant to do now, to take a love freely chosen and offer it not as inheritance and not as renunciation, but as completion. So they made it up. That, Hermione thought, was rather the point. The dead had bound their love into the blood because the world would not let them have it freely. The least their descendants could do was have it freely, in the open, by choice, with no magic compelling a single second of it. "We should hold hands," she said. "The way they did, the way we did when we broke it." "I'm starting to think," Draco said dryly, taking her hand, "that the entire architecture of soul magic is just an elaborate excuse to hold hands. Generations of wizards, and not one of them could simply ask." "It's possible," she said, "that asking is harder than the magic." He looked at her in the starlight, and something in his face softened past all its old defenses. "Yes," he said quietly, "I'm finding that." They stood at the rail, hand in hand, where they had stood to let each other go, and this time they spoke no borrowed words. There was no renunciation to recite, no vow written in a dead woman's cramped hand. Hermione had thought, on the walk up, that she would compose something, that she would find the right formal sentences, the way she found the right words for everything. But standing there with the stars coming down and Draco's hand warm in hers, and the whole castle sleeping below them, the formal words fell away, and what was left was simpler. "This is ours," she said, "to him and to the night, and to the two who were no longer in it. Not given, not inherited, not because the magic chose us. It didn't. In the end, we sent it home. We're choosing this. Me, freely, knowing exactly whose it is." Her hand tightened on his. "You waited 100 years to see your love finished. So here, it's finished. It came out the other side. Rest now." Draco was silent for a moment. Then, low, in a voice she had never heard him use, stripped entirely of irony, of armor, of the cold music he'd been raised to speak in, he added his own. "I don't have your gift for the right words," he said. "I never did. But I know what you wanted us to be, the two of you. You wanted to be ordinary, the house with the rain, the reading in the next room, the dull, safe, endless days you never got to have." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "We'll have them for you. The ordinary days. I swear it on a name you tried to strike off a tapestry and couldn't quite kill. We'll have all of them." The night did not break open this time. There was no tearing, no flood, no presence departing. There was nothing left to depart. The ghosts had gone 3 nights ago. But something happened anyway, something quieter. The torch flared once, briefly, gold against the cold, and a breath of warmth moved across the tower that the cleared sky could not account for, and Hermione felt, for one last instant, fainter than a memory, the brush of 2 presences she had been carrying towards something her whole life without knowing it, turning at last and going, not in grief this time, but in peace. The long debt paid, the unfinished thing finished, the love that had waited 100 years finally allowed to rest. And then it was just the 2 of them on a cold tower under the stars, holding hands. Did you feel that? she whispered. Yes. His voice was unsteady. They're gone. Properly gone this time. They got their ending. We gave it to them. No, he said, and turned to face her and brought his free hand up to her cheek the way he had in the rain, the way he had in the hospital wing, the gesture that was wholly his now and owed nothing to anyone dead. We gave it to us. They just got to watch. They were married 4 years later, which everyone who knew them agreed was approximately 3 years and 11 months sooner than either of them would have predicted, and a small eternity later than they had both privately wanted. There was a great deal of difficulty in between. There always is with real things. There were arguments that shook the windows and silences that lasted days. There was the slow, grinding work of two proud people learning to be known. There was a war's worth of wreckage in his past that did not vanish because she loved him, and a hardness in her that did not soften because he did, and the long, patient labour of two people choosing each other again on the ordinary mornings when the choosing was not romantic at all. The bond would have made it easier. That was the thing they both understood and never quite said aloud, that a soul binding would have spared them all of it, would have fused them past the possibility of leaving. They had given that away. They had chosen instead the harder thing, a love with a door in it that either of them could have walked out of at any time, and that they stayed inside anyway, every day on purpose. It was, Hermione thought, standing at the window of a house that had, against all odds, a window seat, with rain on the diamond panes and Draco's low voice reading aloud in the next room, in a cadence she had first heard in a dream 100 years and several lifetimes ago. It was a far better thing than anything inherited. She went to the doorway. She leaned against the frame and watched him read, the book balanced in his long, pale hands, the silver ring catching the lamplight, and she let him not know she was there for as long as the moment would hold. The way a woman in blue had once watched a man she could not have across a century through borrowed eyes. Except that Hermione could have him. That was the whole of it. That was everything the dead had wanted and never got, handed to the living free and clear. She could simply cross the room. So she did. He looked up as she came, and he smiled, that real, unguarded thing she had once thought she'd never live to see. And he set the book down and held out his hand, and she took it, freely, knowing exactly whose it was, and the rain came down soft and endless on the glass, and somewhere far off and long ago, two people who had waited 100 years for precisely this, finally, completely rested. The house had a name, though they almost never used it. It had come to them the way everything important in their life together had come, sideways, unplanned, against the expectations of nearly everyone who knew them. A small stone house at the edge of a Welsh valley, half a day from anywhere, with a slate roof that drummed under rain, and diamond-paned windows that had been set into the walls 2 centuries before either of them was born. Hermione had seen it once, in an estate agent's listing, and had gone very quiet. Draco had looked over her shoulder at the photograph of the front room, the window seat, the rain on the glass, the light, and had said nothing at all, and they had bought it within the week, and neither of them had ever spoken aloud about why. They didn't need to. Some things between them had stopped needing words a long time ago. It was a Sunday in late autumn, years on now, and the rain had set in for the afternoon the way it did in that valley. Soft and grey and endless. The kind that made the house feel like the last warm place in the world. Hermione sat on the window seat with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow and a book open and unread in her lap, watching the water run down the old glass. And she was happy in the particular quiet way she had learned over the years to recognize as happiness. It had taken her a long time to trust it. Happiness, for both of them, had once been the thing that arrived right before something was taken away. They had spent years flinching from it. They had stopped, eventually. Not all at once, but they had stopped. In the next room, Draco was reading aloud. She could hear his voice through the wall, low and even, that careful, patient cadence she had first heard in a dream 100 years before she met him. And she let herself sit with the strangeness of that, as she still sometimes did. That a dead woman in a blue dress had once stood in a doorway exactly like this one, in a house exactly like this one, and watched a man she could not have read aloud in a room she was not allowed to enter. That the longing of it had been so vast it had survived a century in the blood, waiting. That it had found its way at last to two people who had every reason in the world to refuse it. They had refused it. That was the part Hermione never forgot. They had stood on a tower in the rain and sent it back. They had chosen, instead, the harder and smaller and infinitely better thing, a love they built themselves, from nothing, with their own hands, on the ordinary days. She set down her book and went to the doorway. She leaned against the frame and watched him, the way she had that first evening years ago, the way the woman in blue had watched across a century of borrowed eyes. He didn't notice her at first. He was bent over the book, his pale hair fallen forward, the silver ring, the heir's ring, struck from a tapestry and surviving anyway, the way he had, catching the lamplight as he turned a page. There was a child asleep against his chest. That still undid her sometimes, the sight of it. Draco Malfoy, who had grown up in a house that taught him love, was a cage and a debt and a transaction, sitting in the lamplight with their daughter asleep on him, reading aloud in a voice gone soft so as not to wake her. He had been so certain once that he did not get to have this. That happiness was not a thing he had budgeted for. She had watched him learn, slowly, painfully, over years, that he was wrong, and the learning of it had been the great work of both their lives, harder than any spell, harder than the bond had ever been. The girl had Hermione's wild hair and Draco's grey eyes and a temper the household had already established that belonged entirely to herself. She was 4. She was asleep with one fist closed in the front of her father's jumper, and Draco had stopped actually reading some minutes ago, Hermione realized. He was just turning the pages now, murmuring whatever came to mind, because the sound was what kept her under, not the words. He looked up and caught Hermione in the doorway. He smiled. That real, unguarded thing she had once thought she'd never live to see, and had now seen 10,000 times, and had never once stopped being grateful for. "How long have you been standing there?" he said, very quietly, so as not to wake the child. "A while." She came into the room and sat on the arm of the chair close against him and looked down at the sleeping girl. You stopped reading the actual book 3 pages ago. You've been making it up. She doesn't know the difference. I know the difference. You, he said, are not the target audience. But he tilted his head against her arm as he said it, and she felt the whole long weight of his contentment settle against her. And for a moment they simply sat together in the lamplight, with the rain on the glass and their daughter asleep between them, and no one said anything at all. It was in moments like this that she thought of them, Cassandra and Calum, the two who had waited. She didn't think of them often anymore. The ghosts had gone, truly gone. That cold, clear night on the tower, the long debt paid, the unfinished thing finished. There were no more dreams. No more borrowed grief. No presence under her ribs that wasn't her own. For years now, her heart had beaten in its own time, in a rhythm she recognized entirely, and the feelings she had for the man beside her had never once, in all that time, turned out to be anyone's but hers. But she thought of them now, on afternoons like this one, because this, the rain, the window seat, the reading aloud, the child, the ordinary, endless safe day, this was the exact thing they had died wanting and never got. The dull, precious life, the house with the rain. They had loved each other so much and so impossibly that they could not have the small things, the daily things, the boring, beautiful things. And so they had poured all that thwarted longing into the blood and sent it down the years like a message in a bottle. Have this for us, the message had said. We couldn't. Have it, have all of it. And they had. That was the thing Hermione found she wanted to say to them on afternoons like this, into the rain-grey quiet, to two people 100 years dead. We have it. The ordinary days. All of them. The house and the rain and the reading and the child asleep. We have the thing you wanted. Rest now. It's finished. It came out the other side. She had said it once, out loud, on the tower years ago. She thought it again now, silently, and felt nothing brush against her in answer, because there was nothing left to brush. And that absence, that clean and total silence, was its own kind of peace. The dead were at rest. The living were warm. The accounts were settled. "What are you thinking about?" Draco said. He was watching her. He still read her better than anyone alive. He had simply gotten quieter about it over the years, less likely to use what he saw as a weapon. "Them," she said. There was no need to say which them. There never had been. He was silent for a moment. His hand moved on the child's back, slow and absent. "I think about them too," he admitted. "Less than I used to, but on days like this." He looked at the window, the water running down the old glass. "I used to be angry about it, for a while, that the first thing I ever felt that didn't have a hook in it was a borrowed thing, that a ghost had to teach me what it was even supposed to feel like." He shook his head slightly. "But I don't think that's right anymore. I don't think she taught me to love you. I think she just..." He searched for it. He had never been good with the words. He had told her so, on the tower, and it had stayed true. "I think she opened a door. That's all. She couldn't make us walk through it. We did that part ourselves." "We did," Hermione said softly. "Every day," he agreed. "That's the part she never got. They got the grand thing, the soul-binding, the century, the great roaring tragedy of it. They never got the unremarkable Tuesdays." The arguments about whose turn it is, the reading aloud to a child who's already asleep. His mouth curved. I'd take our Tuesdays over their tragedy, every time. The girl stirred against his chest, murmured something in her sleep, and went still again. The rain went on. The lamp burned steady and gold against the grey afternoon, and outside the diamond panes, the valley faded into mist. And inside the small stone house at the edge of nowhere, 3 people sat together in the warm and the quiet, having, freely and fully and forever, the precise ordinary life that 2 long-dead lovers had broken the laws of death itself to pass forward. Hermione leaned down and kissed the top of her daughter's head, and then she leaned over and kissed Draco, slowly, easily, with the deep, unhurried certainty of a woman who had crossed the room 10,000 times and would cross it 10,000 more. And he kissed her back, careful of the sleeping child, his free hand rising to her cheek in the gesture that was wholly his now and owed nothing to anyone, living or dead. I love you, she said against his mouth. It's mine. It was always going to be mine. I know, he said. It's the only thing I've ever been sure of. Outside, the rain came down soft and endless on the old glass, the way it had in a dream 100 years ago, the way it would for all the ordinary days still to come. And somewhere far off and long ago, 2 people who had waited a century for precisely this were not waiting anymore. They were home, all of them, at last.
So that's the end. Thank you for staying with me all the way. When I started writing this story, I wanted to ask one simple question. Can love be real if magic puts in there? Or is just borrowed? Thank That's why I made the costs. 2 people who died a long time ago, they loved each other but they could not be together, so they put their love into their blood, and they waited for 100 years, and then it landed on Draco and Hermione. My favorite part to write was the rain, the night on the tower. They hold hands, they want to break the bond, they say the words, and the ghosts go away. But here is the thing, the feeling stays. That was the whole point for me. When you take the magic away, something is left, and that something is real, that something is serious. I think love is like that for all of us. Sometimes we need a little push, a little reason to be brave, but in the end we choose. We cross the room, we take the hand. Draco was scared. He thought he did not deserve to be happy. Hermione was scared too. She thought maybe her heart was not her own, but they chose each other anyway, with their eyes open. No magic, just 2 people, and I think that is the most beautiful magic of all. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart, and if you find your person, cross the room. I'll see you in the next story.